My name is Bill Schneidwin. I'm the director of the L&D Leiden Center for Jewish Studies at UCLA. I'm really delighted to have you all here today. I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Professor Bakos, but I want to say one thing, because today we have both Professor Bakos and Professor Schwartz, who worked on the new Posen volume. And their work on the Posen volume, particularly Professor Bakos, made the cover of, I think, UCLA Today. There's an article about it, and it is. I just learned that it won a Jewish Book Award. So it's really exciting to have Professor Bakos and Professor Schwartz, who co-authored the introduction to the volume. So it's good to have you. Congratulations.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Great. Yes. Good afternoon. Yeah. So, on behalf of, thank you so much, Bill, for that lovely remark and endorsement. Much appreciated. On behalf of the UCLA Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies, I, like Professor Schneidwin, would like to welcome you to this year's Etta and Milton Levy Scholar in Residence final event with our resident, Professor Seth Schwartz of Columbia University. And today he will be speaking about Jews and God-fearers with an emphasis on Aphrodisias of the 5th century. As this is the last of the Levy, last event on the Levy Center's calendar, we hope that you'll be able to join in the next academic year for many, many more events. I'd like to thank the Levy Center staff for making the arrangements for today's event. As always, they are exceedingly reliable, and we are forever grateful for their hard work. Before we get started, please, just a reminder to silence your phones. So, I really feel that Professor Schwartz needs no introduction. For anyone who knows anything about the field of Jewish studies, in particular ancient Judaism, knows that Seth Schwartz is the leading scholar whose work has been formidable and truly groundbreaking. Seth Schwartz is the Lucius N. Littauer Professor of Classical Jewish Civilization in the departments of History and Classics at Columbia University, where he is also the chair of the graduate program in Classical Studies. He's the author of several monographs, including his Imperialism and Jewish Society, 200 BCE to 640 CE, that was published with Princeton in 2001. And it is not an exaggeration to say that Imperialism and Jewish Society created a seismic shift of sorts in ancient Jewish historiography. So we're so thrilled that he's here with us. And we'll learn at your feet, so to speak. Other works of equal importance are Were the Jews a Mediterranean Society, Reciprocity and Solidarity in Ancient Judaism, and the Ancient Jews from Alexander to Muhammad. His forthcoming work, The Jews of Asia Minor, 215 BCE to 500 CE, Text and Materiality, will be published, Bezrat Hashem, inshallah, by University of Chicago Press in November. And I suppose his biggest claim to fame, or my biggest claim to fame, is that I once was his TA when I was doing my doctoral work. So thank you, and welcome, Seth Schwartz.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, Carol, for that partly accurate introduction.
You were my TA.
And Bill, no, someone's TA. I remember you. And and Bill also. I'm just going to plunge right in. Today I want to talk about a very familiar topic in the general field of ancient Jewish studies and early Christianity, which is the status of people who we, following some ancient sources, call God-fearers. This is a translation of a set of Greek terms. In earlier texts, they're called something like phobumenoi or sebomenoi ton theon, that is, fearers or worshippers of the god. And in later texts, they're called similarly theosebes, a contraction of the earlier term. And theosebes could mean simply people who are pious, but it seems possible or likely that it came to have a technical meaning. And what it referred to technically was people normally supposed to have been Gentiles. And I would go further and say that they're normally supposed to be, I know this is a problematic word, but it's a brief way of expressing it, pagans. Say polytheists because polytheists is wrong, and I won't get into why. Pagans is bad, but they're all bad. So I will call them pagans anyway. And but such people who had some sort of connection with Jews or Judaism or Jewish communities, leaving open the question of what precisely this all consisted of. This is, as I suggested, not unplowed turf. If anything, there's a small library of modern scholarship, and modern scholarship is out of all proportion to the ancient evidence, which is something that people who work on antiquity in general are used to. There's more scholarship than there is evidence, and especially once you wander into the vicinity of New Testament studies, there the bibliography just blows up, and this is a field of some importance to New Testament studies for reasons that I'll get to in a second. I think that in light of this, what do I have to say? And the answer may turn out to be nothing of great interest, but I think that what I do have to add to the subject comes from the fact that I am not in the field of religious studies, which has been the dominant field in the discussion of this subject. I think that religious studies people and their theologian ancestors have dominated the topic in a way that has produced diminishing returns and was, to a large extent, vitiated by idealism. I'm not going to say much more about that. But, to give some examples of what the scholarship has focused on, there was actually a fundamental question that people used to ask, and to some extent still do, as to whether there really was such a phenomenon as God-fearing at all. And the issue here is really not so much idealism as nominalism. In other words, what people did was word studies, where they looked for these terms, phobunoi, ton theon, or theosebes, and tried to figure out whether these terms refer to a distinct group of people, or whether they just refer to people who are in general pious. And they might be Jews, or they might be pagans, or they might be Christians, or they might be anyone. There's no question that there are ambiguous cases in the ancient sources. For example, the first century Jewish historian writing in Greek tells us that the Empress Papaya, that is not the fruit by that name, but the consort of the Emperor Nero, was someone who was, I don't remember if he uses the term theosebes or that she was phobumene ton theon, that she was fearful of the god. Does this mean that she was a technical God-fearer, or does it mean that she was just a person of pious disposition? And you can't tell in that case. It's difficult to figure out what the answer is. But actually, I think that the question of whether, why, how there were Gentiles who stood in some relationship to Judaism without converting to it doesn't need to be so firmly anchored in word studies, because it's clear that there was such a phenomenon, which is locatable in various sources in various periods. And the terminology does matter, but the terminology maps on to a related set of social phenomena only imprecisely. And I'm interested more in the social phenomena than I am in the word study aspect of it. In any case, there was a piece of material which was published for the first time in 1986, and that's actually the main focus of the talk. You can see it on your handouts. This is the famous Godfearers inscription from Aphrodisias, which really seemed to solve the question, at least for its time and place, once and for all, because there is not the slightest shadow of a doubt that in this inscription, the term God-fearers, theosebes, is being used to describe a specific group of people. It doesn't just mean pious people. It means the God-fearers, capital G. And so it has a technical meaning, which led some scholars to try to refine the question in a way which I think is potentially productive, and something I'm going to address too, which is whether there was a continuous feature of Jewish history in antiquity of God-fearing, that is, of non-Jews who were always present in some version of Jewish communities through time with some sort of stability and some sort of self-conscious existence. And this is a good question, not to spoil it, but this is not really what I'm talking about. Well, it is a little bit what I'm talking about, but the answer is no. Although, now that I've said that so blatantly, it's not in my text here. I might want to backpedal from that a little bit when the moment comes, but still, that's more or less the answer is kind of like no. A lot of scholarship, because it's interested in the religious studies aspect of the question, has been concerned with the content of God-fearing. And this is actually really difficult to resolve. So people often point to a passage in the 14th satire of the Roman satirist Juvenal, who lived at the beginning of the 2nd century, where he's talking about bad parenting. That's the topic of the 14th satire. So he talks about a family where the father, he says, fears the Sabbaths, metuens sabbata, and doesn't eat pork. But his son goes all the way and is circumcised and adopts the Judaicum jus, the laws of the Jews, and rejects the Romanum jus, rejects the Roman law. Apparently the father, by observing some Jewish customs, had not done this, so the father still was holding on to his proper metropolitan, respectable Roman identity, but because he paved the way for such a bad father to his son by inspiring him to follow in his footsteps and go further in the direction of adopting Jewish customs, he was a bad guy. So Juvenal has nothing to say about the communal aspects of God-fearing, which seems to be the main thing that turns up in other texts. For Juvenal, it's all about an individual set of choices. He doesn't indicate that the father who fears the Sabbaths, whatever that entails exactly, and doesn't eat pork, is doing so because he's associated with some Jewish community, which certainly existed at Rome in Juvenal's time. He just is not addressing it, and partly it's because of the theme of the satire. It's not relevant to the theme of the satire. But, on the other hand, in the New Testament, the book of Acts, which has a number of stories which are concerned with the phenomenon of God-fearing, it's all about community. That seems to be the main thing that makes you a God-fearer. That is, if you are participating in some aspects of Jewish communal life. And look at the texts in a few seconds. But beyond that, well, did these people reject their gods? Not necessarily, but maybe they did. As in Juvenal's scenario, did their children become Jewish? Probably, we have no way of knowing. What were the details of their observance of Jewish law, if any? And again, we don't know, aside from going to synagogue, which, in the opinion of the author of the book of Acts, seems to have consisted entirely of public Torah study. There's no prayer, but just public Torah study, also not the ritualized Torah reading, which becomes the standard, starting in the rabbinic period. It's an earlier period. Philo and Josephus in the New Testament always talk about Torah study as being a feature of Jewish liturgical practice. They say very little about prayer, which has led some scholars to think that they didn't pray in first century synagogues. Not so clear cut, but Luke follows that. Luke being the author of Acts. That is, Luke and Acts. The Gospel of Luke and Acts are volume 1 and volume 2 of one book. So he's conventionally, the author of Acts is conventionally called Luke, just in case that's confusing. Okay, so we'll get back to Luke, or Acts, rather, in a few minutes. I want to think instead about the social historical angle. Yesterday, for those of you who were there, although I didn't actually directly address the issue of God-fearers, I kind of laid out the bare bones of the sociological model that informs my account of what the God-fearers were doing in Josephus and in Acts, that is in the first century texts, and not necessarily in later texts, but in first century texts down, maybe even down to Juvenal and a little beyond. And I noted, as I suggested, that model doesn't really explain the information that we have from the later period, from Aphrodisias in Sardis in the late 4th and 5th centuries. It seems to be doing something totally different there. So in order to lay it out with a little bit more clarity, I'll just say a few words about what I have in mind. Groups of Jews were not an automatic fit in the Greek city. And by the way, this is one thing where Jewish historians and other people who are interested in the ancient Jews really have missed the boat because they're thinking in terms of a sort of internalist Jewish history in which Jews have unlimited agency to define themselves. But in real life, Jews had only very limited agency to define themselves. They were living in cities which had an investment in defining them. So why? Because Greek cities before the Middle and later Roman Empire were very exclusivistic entities. You couldn't just turn up one day in a Greek city and say, okay, I'm a citizen of a Greek city. And if you were a citizen of a Greek city in the late Hellenistic and early Roman period, it was an exclusive identity. You were a citizen of that city, it precluded your being something else. So Jews were not automatically eligible for integration into the life of the Greek city. I would guess, and if I had more time I would do more than guess, but just for the sake of brevity, I'll say that I would guess that Jews in that later Hellenistic period, when they begin turning up in Greek cities in what would later be, or what was becoming, the Eastern Roman Empire, were resident aliens. It's a well-known category of life in the Greek city called metoikoi in Greece, that is, people live side by side with the citizens, and they have limited civil rights and no political rights, and they have some right, they can conduct business. One of the things interesting that they don't have the right to automatically is the right to have a patris. That is, medics, resident aliens, don't automatically have a right to claim their former citizenship as still applicable to them in their new place of settlement. So it doesn't need to be Jews. It could be a Corinthian living in Athens. It could be a person from Smyrna living in Miletus. If they have settled in their new place of settlement, they've lost their ability to claim the citizenship of their original settlement, and their status is now that they are medics. M-E-T-I-C-S, metoikoi in Greece. Metoikos is singular. And by the way, I'm actually flying in the face of a lot of the field in arguing that Jewishness was a relatively discrete and well-defined status, because there are many people who argue that no, it's very ill-defined, it's very porous. It's porous for sure. People could certainly float in and out of it, but there is a definite boundary, and the boundary is not necessarily set by the Jews. The boundary is set by the people among whom the Jews in the diaspora, at least, are living, who have a vested interest in keeping the Jews out of their polity or marginalized in their polity. Okay, so where are we here? In the period of Roman rule, which began in Asia Minor, what we now call Turkey, in 129 BCE, then ended in around 90 BCE, and then began again around 70 BCE, around the same time that it began in Syria, some Jews began to lobby for enhancements in their status, with the support of the Hasmonean rulers in Jerusalem. This is clearly reflected in some documents that Josephus quotes. That is, Jews didn't want to be only medics, they wanted to have a particular separate status. And the Hasmoneans were actually interested in the Jews claiming this status, even I think in some cases where the Jews themselves weren't all that interested in it. But the Hasmoneans seemed to develop an investment in it, and it looks like some Jews living in Greek cities, in places like Asia or Greece or Syria, began to go along with them. We actually have, preserved by Josephus, some bits of legislation passed by the Roman Senate before Caesar's dictatorship, which concerns this issue. Actually, most of the documents that Josephus quotes, which concern the issue of the Jews' status in Greek cities, come from a very small period. They come from a period from about 50 BCE to sometime in the reign of the Emperor Augustus. So, in other words, they stretch over about 50 years. There's not that much before, and there's very, very little after. One of the interesting things about the decrees quoted by Josephus, except for the two that I discussed yesterday, the one by Julius Caesar, which is actually very vague, and the much less vague one by his adoptive son Augustus from approximately the year 3 BCE. Otherwise, almost all of these letters, decrees, or what are called rescripts, that is, responses to questions from local Roman administrators, were issued by politicians who were discredited in the course of the Roman civil wars. It's a bizarre thing, but almost everyone was by them. There were a lot of them. One of the crucial foundational ones, the earliest one from about the year 49 BCE, is from a senatorial decree issued by a character named Lucius Cornelius Lentulus Crus, who was a supporter of Julius Caesar's competitor, Pompey, who was about to be defeated a year later by Caesar. And so Lentulus Crus was on the losing side of the civil war, and yet, whoever collected those documents that Josephus is preserving was very committed to preserving every bit of legal stuff that came out of Lentulus Crus's Roman magistracy. The other example, which is one of the most, clear-cut grant of privileges to Jews in Asia Minor, was issued by Publius Cornelius Dolabella, who was an enterprising and corrupt politician who managed to be a supporter of Caesar and of the assassin Brutus simultaneously. And for this bit of cleverness, he paid with his life. In the year 43, and when he was killed, all of his laws were rescinded. And yet there it is in Josephus's collection. And it's a very wonderful law because it's so friendly to the Jews. But it was a law which, by its very nature, as the people who collected the decrees and probably later read them, probably weren't aware that the law had no legal force whatsoever. It had been officially rescinded by the Roman Senate years and years earlier. So Josephus and probably his sources, who were probably leaders of Asian Jewish communities, were unaware of the provenance of the letters. Like, they didn't realize that these were all people who were on the losing side in the civil wars, or they suppressed it. And this may show just how desperate they were to find and catalog pro-Jewish legislation. In other words, so we should be careful not to be misled by all of the information that Josephus provides us about the privileges that Jews came to enjoy in Greek cities in the last period of the Roman Republic, before the Emperor Augustus took over. Then Augustus takes over, and it actually is a little bit different because Augustus issues a decree which is very clear-cut and definitely recognizes the rights of the Jews, who are now called an ethnos, translating the Latin term natio, a nation, as in our sense, but still in some sense, to follow their own customs wherever they live. But the other stuff that's preserved in this file of material is nothing. So this tells us a little bit about, the status of the Jews in Greek cities and the limitations on their agency. that it points towards a situation which was actually quite fragile. The collection of documents which Josephus provides certainly indicates that Jewish lobbyists in Asia Minor were prepared to waive evidence in the faces both of the city councils and of Roman magistrates. Josephus describes an episode in which the Jews of Ionia, which is on the west coast of Turkey, of Asia Minor, convinced the Emperor Augustus's son-in-law and second in command, Marcus Agrippa, that they should be allowed to preserve their own customs in the cities of Ionia, even when those customs contradict the interests of the cities. In particular, they're interested in sending silver and gold to Jerusalem. And the cities are not allowing them to send silver and gold to Jerusalem because you don't want precious metals, which otherwise might find their way into the city treasury, to be sent out of the province. And actually, the Roman Senate wasn't happy to do that either. The Roman Senate wanted to restrict the flow of silver and gold to any place other than Rome. But the Jews had the privilege granted to them by Augustus. And the interesting thing here is that, number one, the Jews actually had to argue that a privilege already granted to them by Augustus should be applied to them. And number two, they also needed the intervention of the Jewish king Herod to make it happen. That Herod was present. He was visiting Agrippa, and he encouraged Agrippa to grant the Jews' request. So this gives us some sense of this sort of support that the Jews could normally expect to get from Rome, even when there were laws which had granted them a set of privileges. It still took effort to convince the same people who had issued the privileges to actually apply them and to stand up to city councils in cities which were trying to not fulfill the law and to restrict the Jews' privileges. Okay. In other words, the city councils could often impose their will on the Jews with little meaningful opposition, even in the period when the Jews already were able to waive documents indicating that the emperors had given them these gifts in the faces of the city councils. It didn't make that much of a difference. It made some difference, but not a huge amount. So, what were the Jews supposed to do? It sounds like they were actually in a pretty tight spot in those Greek cities, and this is something which is indicated in Josephus's material also, that there's a sort of sense of struggle, that they have to struggle to be allowed to live as Jews. What were Jews supposed to do if they couldn't really rely on the regular responsiveness of the Roman government, and the city councils tended to be hostile? Well, we can guess a range of possibilities. They could do nothing, and just try to get along as well as they could, and hope for the best. Well, they could riot, which might be effective, because the Romans, the same sort of Roman negligence which allowed the city councils not to fulfill the official laws, also allowed for a fairly high degree of violence in cities in the Roman Empire. It's something we don't always keep in mind, that the Roman urban landscape could be surprisingly, hard to compare it with our standards, but I'm not sure what our standards are. I guess it depends what neighborhood you're in. And maybe this was true in ancient cities too. There was a certain amount of violence which the government was prepared to tolerate. So riot is possible. Bribery might be good. But in order to do that effectively, you need to be rich, and it doesn't seem as if the Jews living in these cities were often very rich. I have no doubt that Jews tried all these things and other things in various places in order to secure their place in the cities. You think of the medieval period where Jews famously cultivated vertical alliances rather than horizontal alliances. But that was in a broken up political environment where the sovereigns were local. In other words, Jews cultivated a relationship with the local bishop or the local lord if you were in the German lands, or with a king if you were in France or in England. But these were people who were actually local authorities who had, at least in some cases, in the case of England maybe, some measure of control over what was going on in much of the country. The Roman emperor was far away. So that vertical alliance which the Jews had cultivated was, as I've said, not very effective. I think that one thing that some of them did in some cases successfully was somehow figure out how to cultivate the goodwill of some segment of the local Greek population of the cities in which they lived. That's what I get from the stories in the book of Acts and some other parallel stories in Josephus, and that is what God-fearers are for. I don't know who they are, but I think I can figure out what they were for. And actually, there was another old question in the theological literature: did Jews seek converts? And I would say the answer to that is no. Converts weren't any good for them. They didn't want people to join them. They want people to befriend them, because a friend is more useful than someone who joins them. If you join the Jews, then you're just another one of them. What good are you? You want someone who's in the position where they can intervene with the city council on your behalf. So you're trying to cultivate friendship with certain groups of local Greeks. Well, I don't know how you go about doing that. And the sources don't really tell us. We can speculate a little bit about some things. For example, is this behind the disappearance, almost complete disappearance, of liturgical and biblical Hebrew in favor of Greek? The fact that in most of these places, the only liturgical language and the only language in which the Bible was read and studied was Greek. This is actually part of there were people who, as you can see with the spread of Christianity, there were people who were taken in by weird texts. Like there were Greeks who thought, not everything needs to be Demosthenes. There are these other texts also which have a certain gravity to them, and precisely because they're so odd and because they sound so little like classical Greek. And people attracted by all sorts of strange things. So why not be attracted by the weirdness of just the sound of the Bible? There was a writer, not really known who he was, of a book called Perihoupsus in Greek, On the Sublime, who regarded the first verse of the book of Genesis as an example of the literary sublime in Greek. Now, in Greek, actually, if your image of Greek is shaped by Homer or by the orators or by the great historians or the philosophers, the sentence "en archaea pois en hotheos ton tengen kaiton oranon," that sounds terrible if you're a very snooty Greek. That doesn't sound like Greek at all. But it actually might be exotic enough for some people to think, wow, there's something profound here that we're not quite getting. So is that part of the story? I don't know. I'm speculating, but maybe it is. What else did they need to do in order to attract friendly attention from local Greeks? Well, I don't know. And I don't know what was motivating the Greeks. I think I can figure out what was motivating the Jews. And that's what I'm concerned with right now. So this works for the first century for me. I've explained it to my own satisfaction for the first century. And we can look at the handout at a few passages, read them in great detail, but especially from the book of Acts and Josephus' Jewish War, which is similar in general thrust. So Acts tells the story of Paul and his associate Barnabas visiting a city called Antioch in Pisidia, which, strangely enough, was not in Pisidia at all. It was in Galatia, but it was called Antioch in Pisidia, despite being in Galatia, like East New York. No, East New York is in New York. West New York is in New Jersey. Kansas City in Missouri. It's just, So anyway, and this is a typical scene. So Paul and Barnabas arrive in Pisidian Antioch, and the first thing they do is they go to the synagogue on the Sabbath, and they take a seat. And then the law and the prophets are read, and the heads of the synagogue, the archi-synagogues, the heads of the synagogue say to them, "Brothers, if you have some word of consolation for the people, ton la'on." That's actually a term which is often used in inscriptions to refer to a Jewish community. It means, it's a mechanical translation of the Hebrew word am. So it fundamentally means the same thing. It has the same semantic range. A clan group kind of expanded into any sort of assembly, like an armed military assembly could also be called olaos. But it was a common word for a Jewish community. So some excessively critical New Testament scholars have thought, well, why would they have gone and asked Paul to go and give a sermon? Who is he? I think the answer is he was a guy who had come from Jerusalem and looked like he was, if a certain kind of person walks into a synagogue today, you're going to pay him some respect if he looks like he deserves it. So Paul probably looked like he deserved it, and so he was asked to speak. And he goes on and gives a long speech, which is actually a very... He summarizes the story of the Hebrew Bible in a few verses, and then he shifts into the gospel and basically tells the Jews, well, unless you all believe in Jesus, you're all doomed. And that, what kind of reception did he expect, I guess? But interestingly enough, he got a mixed reception. Many of the Jews enjoyed this, and many of the God-fearers, the phovumenoi ton theon, who were present too, also enjoyed this and asked Paul and Barnabas to come back the following week and continue their preaching. So they came back, and the whole city gathered to hear the word of the Lord. But the Jews, that's one of the peculiar things in Acts, is that the Jews are constantly accepting Paul's preaching, but then the Jews chase Paul out of town. So, and there's always a scene when Paul appears in a new place or a new province. He'll always go to the synagogue, and then he'll feel like the Jews are rejecting him, and he'll say, well, for this reason I am now turning to the Gentiles. And then a chapter later, he's going to another town and back to the synagogue. That's a peculiarity of the book of Acts and the story that it tells. The Jews, inciting the wealthy, God-fearing women and the leaders of the city to persecute Paul and Barnabas, they drove them out of their city territory. So it's a clear case where, according to the story in Acts, the Jews are using the influence of the God-fearing women, identified as wealthy God-fearing women, to encourage the city leadership, the Greek leadership of the city, to kick Paul and Barnabas out. And something similar happens at the nearby city of Iconium. Again, they enter the city, and there was a mass of both Jews and Greeks in the synagogue. They're not called now phovunoi ton theon, but just Greeks. And some of the Jews and Greeks believed, but some of the Jews didn't. And once again, the Jews, together with the archons and their Greek allies, kicked Paul and Barnabas out. Then a story, it's just two illustrations, and it may not be that much to base a sociological hypothesis on, but it does, to me, at least the author of Acts thought that this was the role of the God-fearers. And here Josephus tells two other stories which are related to it also, but they come from the time of the Jewish revolt against Rome, and they show the limits of what that type of intervention can achieve. And this is a story of the disturbance at Damascus. You can actually skip down a few lines into it. Happening in year 66, just as the revolt in Jerusalem is breaking out against the Romans, and the cities in the environment are frightened. They're scared that the Jews are going to rise up in their cities also, and Jews are being massacred in some places. In one city, Greeks are being massacred by the Jews, but it's usually Jews who are being massacred by the Greeks. And so Josephus has heard this story about what happened in Damascus. Meanwhile, the Damascenes, having learned of the defeat of the Romans, were eager to kill the Jews living among them. They had long since held them assembled in the gymnasium, so they'd already gathered the Jews and assembled them in one spot, acting out of suspicion, and so believed that their plan would be most easily executed. But they feared their own wives, all of whom, save a few, had been drawn into Jewish ritual, which I think does not mean converted, but it means that they had some relationship with the Jewish community. They were practicing Jewish rituals, and the Greek men of Damascus were afraid that if they couldn't really harm the Jews because their wives would be upset. So they felt they couldn't get away with it. So how did they solve that problem? They took immense pains to avoid detection, and they did it by doing it at night, quickly, and the Jews were already gathered in one place, and I guess the wives never found out that 10,500 Jews had been slaughtered in the gymnasium. Well, I mean, there's room for skepticism about some of the details of the story. But it does indicate something about the kind of limitations of the protection offered by these sorts of relationships. There's another story that Josephus tells about Antioch happening at around the same time, which has a similar kind of structure to it, where the Jews there also had local supporters and protectors, but when the revolt broke out, there was a wave of hostility swept over the city, or anxiety about the Jews rebelling, and that was the end of it. You could say, well, a large percentage of Jews in pre-World War II Germany were married to Christians, and did that save the Jews? No, it didn't. So there are limits that when faced with a real challenge, the Jews rebel, the cities are suddenly scared stiff. And so nothing is going to protect the Jews in that situation. Okay, well, that's my view of it. So, let's see. Okay, so let's move ahead a few centuries. In the 2nd century and the 3rd century and into the 4th century, there's very, very little and possibly even no appearance of the term God-fearer in any text, whether literary or epigraphical, that is inscriptional text. We have no inscriptions. People don't call themselves God-fearers in inscriptions. There have appeared to be a small number of exceptions, but actually the appearances were deceiving. In every case, there was some explanation for it, and in those small number of cases, they resurge towards the end of the 4th century, primarily but not only in 2 places. Sardis, which was the ancient capital of the kingdom of Lydia, which is in the valley of the Hermos in west-central Turkey, and the other place is at Aphrodisias. Aphrodisias is in the meander, the watershed of the original meander, the river called the Meandros in Greek, and now called the Menderes in Turkish. And Aphrodisias is situated on a tributary called the Morsinos to the south of, which branches off to the south from the meander. Aphrodisias was a new city. It was founded in the 2nd century BCE out of several villages which were unified into a single entity. And it became, its basic function was that there were a lot of marble quarries in the vicinity. So it became a sort of center of marble export and also sculpture and, marble working. So that's Aphrodisias. We don't actually hear of any Jews at Aphrodisias before the 4th century. Whereas at Sardis, there, the indications more or less secure of presence of Jews actually possibly even back into the period before Sardis became a Greek city, back into the Achaemenid period, the Persian period, when Sardis was the capital or the chief city of the western part of the Persian Empire. There may have been some Judahites living in Sardis in that period. And then they turn up a little bit more securely later on. So there was a long-standing Jewish presence at Sardis, not at Aphrodisias. But anyway, yesterday I talked about Sardis and about the massive synagogue there, which turns out to be a late antique synagogue, probably constructed as a synagogue around the year 370, and in function as such until possibly the early 7th century, earlier or later. There are a lot of inscriptions commemorating donations to the synagogue. The inscriptions are almost all in Greek, but it's actually a sign of the fact that, in the late Empire, things are beginning to change, that a handful of the inscriptions are now in Hebrew. But almost all of them are in Greek. And many of the inscriptions describe the donors as theosebes, as God-fearers. So they seem to be back. And at Sardis, interestingly enough, both the Jews and the God-fearers seem to be members of the local aristocracy. That is, they're both city councilors, or they both have other sorts of occupations goldsmiths, things like that, which is associated with wealth for obvious reasons. And, so things have clearly changed, at least at Sardis. The Jews are now much wealthier than they had been in the period when Acts is set and when Josephus is writing about. They're now fully involved, or some of them are fully involved in the local city politics. So there's a clear sense that, something has shifted. And I discussed what shifted yesterday, so I'm not going to replicate it. But what shifted was that, for a century after the conversion of Constantine, or a little bit more than a century of the conversion of Constantine, it looks that in Asia Minor, this is a kind of golden age for the Jews. People always think, well, the empire becomes Christian, the Jews go down the drain. Not true. Eventually they do. By the middle of the 5th century, they're clearly beginning to go down the drain. But before that point, they actually have a century and change when things are going pretty well. Because the empire is not really Christian yet. It's actually at a sort of pinnacle of a certain kind of toleration in this period, despite the common image. Nevertheless, so what do we learn from Sardis? I'm not going to say much more about it because we can actually learn some of the same things from Aphrodisias. At Sardis, there doesn't seem to be a meaningful social distinction between Jews, plain old Jews, and God-fearers. And it was that social distinction which seems to have been crucial in the 1st century. The God-fearers, there may have been poor God-fearers, but the God-fearers as a class were important to the Jews because they could exercise influence in the city council. Others may have had other reasons for fearing God, but that was the function of the status. Let's just look at the major text that I want to talk about, which is a rather long one. The heading of it is on the bottom of the obverse of the handout, and the text continues on the reverse. This is an inscription which was discovered in 1976. It was not discovered in situ. We don't know what it marked. There's no mention of a synagogue. It's not clear that there was a synagogue at Aphrodisias. When the text was first published, the publisher of the text, who was a very distinguished epigrapher and archaeologist named Joyce Reynolds, decided, what she actually said was that she felt that on the basis of the letter forms, the text could date any time from about 200 to about 500. So the style of writing wasn't too helpful in trying to figure out the date of the text. But what she and her collaborator noticed was that if it was a text which came from after the year 212, when every Roman subject became a Roman citizen, then you would expect to find some people with Roman names. That is, with a 3-name thing, like Marcus Tullius Cicero, Marcus Tullius Cicero. So you're supposed to have those 3 names if you're a Roman citizen. And in practice, in Asia Minor, you often find people named Marcus Aurelius X, Marcus Aurelius Socrates. And you don't find any of that here. Everyone just has one name. But that actually already should have been a giveaway that it couldn't be from the 12 years between 200 and 212, because there were already plenty of Roman citizens in Asian cities before the year 212. And you would expect to find a few Roman citizens. And actually, the absence of Roman nomenclature just indicates that on this inscription, the decision was made not to use Roman nomenclature. People just had their names, their personal names. And it actually is very common in religious texts. Even in a place where we know everyone was a Roman citizen, that they'll decide not to use their full nomenclature. If they aren't Romans, that is, Romans who live in Italy, in the environment of Rome, they will not use their full Roman nomenclature. They'll just use their personal name, which is the last element of the Roman nomenclature. That's clearly the case here. Further research on the text, especially on the names used in the text, which are the most prominent part of it, indicate that these are texts which belong very clearly and distinctively at the end of the 4th and the beginning of the 5th century. There are actually 2 different texts, side A of the inscription and side B. Side A is later than side B. Side A probably comes from around 420, and side B probably comes from around 400. So they come from a totally different period. They don't tell us, again, anything about, just as the synagogue of Sardis was at an early stage after its discovery was misdated to the 2nd century, this text was also misdated and turns out to be really only about late antiquity, about the early 5th century, 390 to 420, something like that. And it's conventional to start with side A, even though it's later. The thing about side A is that it has a heading. On side B, the heading is broken. So we have the heading. And the heading is, God, helper of the cookshop owners. Why? I don't know why. What's so great about the cookshop owners? I don't know. But there we are. So God is the helper of the cookshop owners. And then it goes on. It loses interest in the cookshop owners. And then it's a list of members of something called the Decani, the Council of 10, of the lovers of learning, also called those constantly uttering blessing. Obviously the name of what in later Jewish communal life would be called the Chevra, that is of a subcommunal society of some sort. That is of a society within the community formed for a particular purpose. It's actually the only example that we have for this sort of thing in antiquity. You don't hear about it otherwise, only in the Middle Ages and later. And they have a very odd name because the name doesn't actually have any identifiable biblical content. It doesn't have any rabbinic parallels, but it's clearly a Jewish-sounding phrase. They're lovers of learning, also called those constantly uttering blessing. Okay. They created this memorial for the consolation of the grief of the masses from their own resources, which sounds like they were probably a burial society. What is in the term decani, is pretty unusual in pre-Christian inscriptions, but in Christian inscriptions, a decania is a burial society. And it looks like it's being used in the same way here. So it looks like this is a burial society. They collect money in order to provide burial for poor people. And then it lists the people involved. The first person, there was an attempt to claim that this Yael, which sounds like a woman's name, was actually a woman's name. But the striking thing about both sets of inscriptions here is that there is not a single other woman's name. And it's actually unusual in inscriptions like this because you usually find, if you look at any synagogue or church inscription, there are women among the donors and there are people who, men and women who make dedications on behalf of their sons and daughters. Women aren't usually omitted. But these are groups which are emphatically masculine. So I don't think that you can really argue that Yael is Yud Ayin Lamed, but it's actually something like Yud Vav Aleph Lamed. It's a different name. Anyway, he's with his son Joshua. He's the head of or maybe one of the heads he's an archon, which means a leader. Theodotus is a palatinos. A palatinos is a government official. In a period when, also a date hint, by the way, because Palatini didn't exist before the Diocletianic reforms at the end of the 3rd century. So this is clearly a late antique title. So it's a name of a pretty high-ranking Roman official, together with his son, Hilarianos. Samuel is the head of the Decani, who is a proselyte, proselutos in Greek. And then we have other people. There's a psalm singer named Benjamin, a Yoses, who's a proselyte. There's a Sabbatios, which is a Jewish-sounding name. Another God-fearer called Ammonios. There's an Antoninos, who is a God-fearer, Samuel, son of Polydeianos. Okay, so just to look at the names, this doesn't give us all that much information. Some of the names are a little hard to, nicknames like Sabathios the Fragrant. I don't know what that really entails, but the names here are actually of interest in several ways because there are 3 groups. There are Jews, there are proselytes, and there are God-fearers. The Jews have a mixture of standard Greek names of the very specific late imperial type. The proselytes all have Hebrew names. Some of the Jews have Hebrew names also. And the God-fearers have only standard Greco-Roman names, no Hebrew names. It gives you I mean, that opens a little bit of a window into what's going on here. We can't say that much about the social rank of these people, except for the Palatinos, who's a government official, Otherwise, it doesn't provide that much information. But side B, which is a little bit earlier, provides a lot more. It seems to start with a list of Jews. We don't know, it's clearly a donation list, a list of donors. It could be to the same burial society, or it could be for something else, an earlier version of the same burial society. We don't know. But here there's a little bit more information. Zenon, son of Jacob, because Zenon is, and by the way, one of the things that we see here is that Jews did not avoid the names of Olympian gods. So we have a Jew, apparently, in the first, on side A, named Hermes. That's a striking thing to be named Hermes. It's like a Jew named Jesus Christ. It's something that you wouldn't, except for the original one, it's something that you wouldn't really expect later on. But it was common, but there was also, his father Zenon, which is derived from Zeus. His father's name was Jacob. And then there's next Manasses, which is Menashe, son of Yoph, is probably a mistake for Yosef, for Joseph. You get, names. There are names which are totally late antique. Biotikos, Eugenios, a goldsmith, and so on. And we have professions here, which is actually very unusual, and for our purposes of great interest. So you have a goldsmith. As I said, goldsmiths are usually wealthy. There's someone called Yaakov, which is a form of Jacob, who's called a probadonomos, which may mean that he's a shepherd, but it may also mean that he's an owner of flocks, which is obviously a very different thing. And a probadonomos is actually not the normal term for a shepherd, and it's not attested elsewhere. But the speculation may be that it's an owner of flocks. And you have a greengrocer, a foreigner, which is not a profession, merchant, bronzesmith, pastry cook, a poulterer, someone who sells poultry. Some of these things are hard to parse. Was the poulterer someone who sold 3 ducks a day in the marketplace of Aphrodisias? Or was he the Aphrodisian Frank Perdue? We can't really figure it out. The term doesn't help us. Zenon, the junk dealer, or used clothes dealer, an animal feed merchant. So what can we say about the status of these people? It's a little bit difficult. We have the first 8 lines are missing, so probably the highest status people are missing. They're gone here. But the other people are ambiguous. They could go either way. They could either be small merchants, or in some cases they could be tycoons. They could be actually people who had significant business concerns. We can't really tell. But then this is followed by a list of God-fearers. And the God-fearers start with, 7 or 9 city councilors. And then it goes to purple dyer, which is, actually often a source of wealth. And then another bronzesmith, which we had a Jewish example of a bronzesmith. A wood tablet maker, probably not the most profitable line of work. A stonemason, which is a major occupation in Aphrodisias, because that's the major industry of the city. And no Jews are called stonemasons, even though that's what people are doing in the city for the most part. Sausage maker, a bangle maker, or alternatively, he was a stutterer. Because he's either pselos, meaning a stutterer, or a pselopoios, or something like that, which would mean a maker of bangles. I can't imagine that you can get rich making bangles, but I could be wrong. I don't know.
Gold bangles.
What?
Gold bangles.
Gold bangles, I guess. A dancer, probably not also a source of wealth. Another bronzesmith, an athlete, a treasurer, painter, and then several people working in textiles, fullers, who are people involved in textile production, and money changers. Again, it's an interesting list of things. The thing to remember here is that the overwhelming majority of people listed don't have their occupations listed. And it seems like many of the occupations which are listed are, on both sides of the divide, possibly surprisingly modest. Now, if you were studying old-fashioned metropolitan Roman social history, you would have learned that the Romans, that is, aristocratic Romans, held things like crafts and small businesses in contempt, and it wouldn't be the kind of thing that you would advertise. But even in the city of Rome, this was completely untrue, and people did commemorate. There's a great funerary monument to a baker on the outskirts of Rome. And once you're outside of metropolitan Rome, people take pride in all sorts of things, which the sort of main, like, upper-class sources don't lead you to expect. So we could have a sort of workman's pride working here. For my purposes, I mean, this is a very fascinating mixture of stuff. Again, the name issue. There is one single God-fearer who has a name which could be construed as Jewish, but it's a very Hellenized Jewish name. He's called Eusebatios, which contains the element Sabbatios, like Shabtai, but it has also Eu before it, meaning good. There are 5 people named Eusebatios on the Jewish side. 5 different people named Eusebatios. There are also some indication of sort of the potential for professional contact. So, for example, Yaakov the Probadonomos, if he was a flock owner, might have actually had a professional connection with the Fullers and Carters among the God-fearers. There are also several bronzesmiths on both sides. So get a sense, it's only very suggestive, and it's not really very clearly defined, that, again, yes, they're the city councilors at the beginning of the God-fearers list, but there could easily have been city councilors at the beginning of the Jewish list as well. They're just lost in the gap. And the first person after 8 lines that has a profession is a goldsmith, which is something which is actually consistent with city council status. Goldsmiths in Sardis, for example, many city councilors were goldsmiths. You didn't have to be a landowner to be a city councilor. You could have a trade, provided it was a very profitable one. So the people who preceded, assuming that there's a kind of descending order in social rank operating in these inscriptions, it's quite possible that the 8 missing lines contain people of fairly grand status. Others are, as I said, the Jews are hard to construe. The God-fearers are easier to construe because some of them have jobs which could not have been that profitable. Dancers, athletes, things like that are not making, on the whole, a lot of money. At one time, they would have been slaves. By this time, I'm not sure that that's any longer the case. I'm not sure that they would have been slaves by now. I suspect that they probably weren't. There's another question. People have always assumed that God-fearers were pagans who had some involvement in the Jewish community. But here we are in the year 400, and, probably a lot of the population of Aphrodisias by now is Christian. The trouble is that this period is just when large-scale name change is beginning to take place. In other words, eventually a truly Christian system of nomenclature develops, but it happens in the course of the 5th century. Before that time, don't always encounter all that many, and identifiable Christians often have just totally standard Greco-Roman names, just like these people here. There are a few possibilities. There's the name Gregorios in a slight variant, Gregorios, son of Tuchikos, and his brother Tuchikos, son of Tuchikos. Tuchikos is one of those common late antique names, and it comes from Tuche, fortune, in the sense of good fortune or bad fortune. But Gregorios, Gregory, although it's in Greek, on the one hand it's a Greek name, on the other hand it's a name which has very, very strong Christian associations. Now, it seems overwhelmingly likely that Gregorios is a Christian. There are a few other possibilities also. I think, the truth of the matter is, for me, what this shows us is that if you're thinking about God-fearing in late antiquity as opposed to the 1st century, number one, the functionalist model breaks down, or the 1st century functionalist model breaks down, and number two, it's not so clear what we have to replace it with. And it could be a matter of family connections. It's very much worth keeping in mind that according to Roman law, for Christians to follow Jewish customs is streng verboten. You're really not allowed to do it. you run the risk of drifting into heresy, and the thing that you really, really don't want to be in the late Roman Empire is a Christian heretic. It's the worst thing it's way worse than being Jewish, and it's way worse than being pagan. Being a Christian heretic, you're an outlaw and you're gone. Jews and pagans are fine. Pagans aren't allowed to offer sacrifice. Jews have become subject to certain restrictions, but the status itself is fine. Pagans are pagans in the 6th century. They're not sacrificing. They're going to church. Probably really Christian, but they call themselves pagans. You can still be a professed paganism, as it were. So something interesting is going on here, where things again. Roman law is not effective. We're back to that principle that Roman law doesn't actually determine how people behave on the ground very often. So yes, Christians being designated in a very formal way, and that's the interesting thing here. They're so unambiguous that these categories seem to be very, very firmly drawn. So in the slightly later texts, it's Jews, proselytes, God-fearers. In the slightly earlier text, no proselytes, Jews and God-fearers. By 420, it's actually more dangerous to be a God-fearer than it was previously. You would think it's still more dangerous to be a proselyte. But there may be a way in which, if you completely alter your status, instead of being in an in-between category, you might be a little bit safer. When I was working on this, there was an interview somewhere in the New York Times, I think, with a young trans person living in the Bible Belt who said that they were originally gay, and then they realized that actually it's safer to be trans in that world than it is to be gay, because you've kind of done away with the ambiguity. You've changed your status, you've crossed into a new status, and people are a little bit, I don't know if this was actually a universalizable truth about it, but it seems suggestive to me that actually, making a complete choice might actually be a somewhat safer thing to do than straddling the border. I don't know if that's the case, but it is striking that there are no proselytes on the earlier text, but only in the later text. So how do we explain it? I think family might account for it. I think the eusabatioi and side B are likely to have some family relationship. Professional or trade relationships might be part of it. But I don't know how the status is functioning. I haven't figured that out. And I think maybe it's not functional. Maybe it's just something that people in some places like to do for reasons hard at this point to recover. And I think that note of ignorance is, I always hope that people come away from my talks more ignorant than when they started, when they came in. That's my goal, is to sow ignorance throughout the land.
No, knowledge that leads to more questioning.
Okay, if you want to put a
Not
positive spin on it
ignorance,
like
a
that.
positive spin. Thank you so much. We have time for questions, comments. Yes, please.
Is there any indication what incentivized Augustus to issue the decree granting Jews the status of nation in the Greek cities?
He says it himself. He actually says that he's looking back to the experience that his father had with the Judean high priest Hyrcanus, son of Alexander, at the time of the Alexandrian War in 47 BCE, when Hyrcanus himself led 1,500 Judean troops into battle at Julius Caesar's side. And because of this act of goodwill, Julius Caesar himself had raised the status of the Jews to an allied nation. And then somehow that status got also applied, and this Julius Caesar, at least in Josephus' version of his decree, does not actually explicitly do. Julius Caesar, or someone, decided that this status applied to Jews wherever they lived, not just in Judea, but also in diaspora environments and non-Judean environments. So that's what Augustus says himself. It was a low-cost gift for the most part, because there weren't that many Jews around, and they were good-willed in those days towards the Caesarian family.
Questions?
Jewish texts in Greek, it's still possible maybe they still use the Hebrew maybe in some kind of transliteration to impress them. And I'm asking that, of course, based on the tractate Megillah, page 10, that they insist about the translation to Greek, that probably was not even a translation, that they have changed Bereshit bara Elohim to Elohim bara Bereshit. So maybe it was
Right.
still, maybe somebody was reading in the original Greek, somebody was writing in Greek transliteration.
Yeah.
Still, the story as you told it, you understand, it still makes sense.
Well, the trouble with that passage in Megillah is that in Greek it doesn't make any difference if you change the word order because it's an inflected language. You still have. It doesn't matter if you say theos and archeia poisen or an archeia poisen ho theos. It's still the same thing in Greek because that's just how Greek works. So that's only in the Bavli, if I remember correctly, where they didn't really, in the Yerushalmi, they would never have made that mistake because they actually knew Greek, and in the Bavli they didn't know Greek. So they could say something like that. But maybe it's in the Yerushalmi also. I don't remember. But I think the trouble is that in the whole corpus of evidence that we have from Jews living in Syria, and there's amazingly little evidence for Jews living in Syria, by the way, and Asia Minor and Greece and southern Italy and all of North Africa, including Egypt, except for some very, very, very early material, and then again for some very late material in all these places, like in the 6th century and following, there's not a word of Hebrew anywhere to be found. There's simply not a word. And there's no in the absence of it, you have people's tombstones here. They're clearly, like in Rome, everyone is putting liturgical formulas on their tombstones. Ene rene he koime sesautu, which is shalom al mishkavo, which we still say. And, but it's in Greek. It never appears in Hebrew until like the 7th century. And someone in southern Italy begins to try to translate it into Hebrew, and it doesn't go that well, and they write the word mishkav, mem, shin, kaf, hey, be, because they don't actually know Hebrew that well, but they know that Hebrew has to be there, and they're starting to use Hebrew. This is a marker of the transition from antiquity to the Middle Ages, is the return to Hebrew. In antiquity, in these places, there's simply no indication. Now, it's possible that Jewish immigrants from the land of Israel in various places might continue to use Hebrew, but they're living in an environment where it's not in general use, so it's not going to last that long. It just doesn't seem as if there's any Hebrew being used.
Yeah, just two quick questions. Just you didn't say anything about the Judaizers and Josephus, just for their general edification.
Right.
And then the other is, I was just struck by the case of the wealthy God-fearing women. What do we make of the women in this context? It's interesting.
Well, it's interesting that women seem to play such a prominent role in the 1st century, and it goes along. I mean, Josephus tells several stories in which aristocratic Roman women are Josephus was not Mr. Feminist, let's say, and he tells several stories in which aristocratic Roman women are sort of beguiled by fraudulent religious types, including an ISIS worshiper and a Jewish person, and this is the reason. This story I don't remember completely, but this story is used to explain why Tiberius, maybe, or Claudius, I don't remember which one, expelled Jews and ISIS worshippers from Rome because of they had hoodwinked these aristocratic Roman women. So there's clearly a sense that women are somehow very heavily involved in these things, not necessarily to the complete exclusion of men, but maybe a little bit more emphatically than men. By the way, that's true also if you look at the apocryphal Gospels. In the apocryphal Gospels, the earlier ones, the chief vectors for the spread of Christianity are women. That is, they're especially interested, again, in sort of upper-class women who, inject Christianity into households. And in these Gospels, that eventually leads to the households becoming Christian, but the people who are doing it are women. So how to explain it, I don't really know, but it seems to be something which has a wider spread than just these few cases. As
And
far
the
as the
Judaizers.
Judaizers are concerned, well, this is one of those passages where Josephus is providing a sort of generalizing summary of the material to follow. And if you are deeply immersed in the works of Josephus, as I was in my day, then you know that in these passages he's often making these broad generalizations on the basis of the single example which he's then going to cite. He's then going to say, everywhere the Jews, there were these people. So there are several ways to approach this. One is to read it that way and to think, well, he's really only talking about these few episodes, and it's not something that was going on everywhere. So his categorization, his use of three not entirely synonymous terms to describe these groups, maybe you shouldn't read too much into it. But then there's another approach which actually thinks that he's talking about three different types of people. That there are people who are acting like Jews, Judaizantes, despite being pagans. There was a doubtful element where you couldn't tell if they were Jews or pagans. And there was a mimigmenon element, a mixed element, where maybe intermarriages of Jews and pagans. So we aren't quite sure who is who in that situation either. But that would, but that might be reading too much into rhetorical flourish, which doesn't actually have all that much content. But it could be wrong. So.
But it would be worth looking at other
Oh,
places
it's been looked at a
in
million
where
times.
He uses
Yeah. It's been looked at a million times. So I'm sort of ignoring the scholarly tradition on it just because it's there. It's a munach bekeren zavit. Anyone can go and look at it, and it's not that vitally relevant at the moment. Although in a larger scale discussion, it would be relevant to figure that out. But it was discussed. There was a long article by Shia Cohen, a long response by other people to Shia Cohen's article about specifically this passage. So there's a footnote.
There you go.
So I don't have to take a position.
You do not at all.
I don't want to court controversy on such a weighty matter.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this, and I really never really looked in the details of this inscription. And I wanted to ask about the actual what they do for a living, what their titles are. It seems, again, just from looking through it, that the ones that are only really found across the categories is like the bronze.
Bronzesmiths, yeah.
Yeah. Do we have any other evidence of like where these, I don't know, let's say workshops or places to hold poultry? Like, is there any other archaeological?
Well, what there is. But actually what there is in Aphrodisias, because the place has been so well excavated and also so well published, is that we know a lot about the Aphrodisian marketplace. And the marketplace, there's a lot to read there. Now, the market, unfortunately, the inscriptional content of the marketplace doesn't say, Sam's hat shop or anything like that. But it does provide a little bit of information. One thing that it actually does, interestingly, is that on some shops there are graffiti of crucifixes, and in other shops there are graffitis of menorahs. And the crucifixes outnumber the menorahs, and there are people, the sort of happy, to use that word again, interpreters of this, like Karen Stern, for example, think, oh, look, they're all getting along together side by side, and then the more bitter Cretan, not with T-A-N, Angelos Chaniotis, took a much darker view at it. He saw that they were in like this sort of head-on competition with each other, that the Christians are trying to suppress the Jews, and they're all like marking up their stores as expressions of, in other words, it's ambiguous what it means, but, it does indicate something about who's in the marketplace. And you can imagine that, these are people who could be, in some cases, in the marketplace side by side. And that may be actually that marketplace may actually be a source of a lot of this stuff, which would actually sort of point in the direction of Karen Stern, as opposed to Angelos Chaniotis. On the other hand, you could also imagine that Chaniotis' faction are the people who are really upset that the Christians are, hanging around with the Jews like this, like John Chrysostom, in Antioch in 387. We don't want them hanging around together, So they're adamant Christians who say, why are you hanging around with the Jews? I mean, you could use your imagination and come up with anything. But there's an archaeological locus where you can actually see where things might have been happening.
I was like, did anyone find a lot of, chicken bones? Or even enter Jewish competition. There's 2 pastry cooks.
Yeah, 2 pastry cooks. Well, they could have been partners.
Partners.
Could have been partners. They could have been. They could have been plotting each other's deaths. We don't know what they were doing. How many pastry chefs do you need in one small city? I don't know.
Oh, well, how many bagel shops do we need in New York?
Yeah, that's different.
Well,
it's New York, and you need a lot of them. But an Aphrodisias? Yeah, I know.
No, scale it. It's all relative. Any other questions, comments? Great. Well, thank you so much. It's really
Okay,
wonderful.
thank you.